So, bienvenue, aloha, and mellow greetings one and all. You are tuned in to Frivolous Gravitas. To our wonderful listeners worldwide on iTunes, Google Podcasts, and YouTube, and wherever else you may be found yourself dialed into this very special episode, it is with tremendous honor that I'm granted the privilege of introducing to you today's guest and star of the show. To discuss his most recent book, Just Reasonable Multiculturalism, we have Raphael Cohen-Almagor. We've been itching to cover the subject for quite a while now, but before we get to that, please allow me to introduce our guest expert joining us today from across the pond. He hails from his professorship at University of Hull, where he is chair in politics and director of the Middle East Study Group. After earning his PhD at Oxford, Dr. Raphael Cohen-Almagor has made himself an astoundingly prolific participant to modern scholarship and social discourse as a world-renowned voice against oppression, abuse, coercion, and violence of many sorts. He has demonstrated a lifelong dedication to serve a greater social good with his breadth of expertise as a fervently outspoken advocate for truth and reconciliation, further demonstrated by his donated time to be with us here today. The doctor has written on heavily weighted subjects, which our listeners will find familiar to the channel, but more specifically, he's published academic papers on such as internet regulation and cyberbullying, end-of-life rights and euthanasia, socio-political pieces analyzing and dissecting Israel-Palestine conflict, and more recently, he's released his newest book titled Just Reasonable Multiculturalism, published by Cambridge University Press. His list of merits could consume our entire broadcast, such as the painful reality of all mortal endeavors. I'll have to be unfair to the distinguished professor and neglect to mention all of his achievements and accolades in their entirety in this brief introduction. I strongly urge our listeners to check the notes in the description for links to more of his work. As our followers have come to appreciate, we don't advertise, promote, or sell anything on this channel. We're comfortable making small exceptions as we did with privacy tools, open source software, and classical literature, etc. We're not being paid to support or endorse anything mentioned on this channel. We just feel it's important for us to use our platform responsibly. This channel aims to promote social discourse and communication in order for us to lessen the needless suffering in the world as much as possible. We promote thoughtful ideas, not necessarily just the ideas we subscribe to personally, but all ideas from solid grounds. And we encourage our listeners to live the best, most fulfilling lives they can through education, awareness, and compassionate understanding. So, with the exhaustive adieux aside, I'd like to thank Professor Cohen-Almagor once again for taking part in our discussions today. Raphael, I'd like you to start us off by discussing or describing your most recent book a little bit. Then maybe we can segue into a summary of Israel-Palestine conflict for the remainder of our time. The book in question is Just, Reasonable Multiculturalism, subtitle Liberalism, Culture, and Coercion. I haven't read it yet, full disclosure, and I don't want to suppose too much from the cover, so perhaps I can ask you what it's about, who it's for, and why it's important, or in other words, what your motivation or inspiration was for writing it and what you hope it achieves or impresses upon its readers.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I'll start with the motivation for the book. So the story of this book actually started in 1991. In 1991, I finished my studies at Oxford, and I went back home to Israel. And the guy that opened his arms to me, returning to the country after 4 years away, was Professor Yehuda Elkanah, who was at that time the president of a research institute in Jerusalem called the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. And Yehuda called me and invited me to be a fellow visitor, advisor, whatever title that I want, put me in office next to him and said, I want you to explore Van Leer, see what you are doing, what we are doing here, and have a 6 months and then decide what you want to do next. And because there are all kinds of study groups and so on that we do, focusing on different subjects, and just enjoy, look around, and tell me what you think. So for 6 months, I was just, looking at all the projects, dozens of projects that Van Leer had, And at the end of some months, I think 4 or 5 months, I went to Yuda. I mean, we've been in touch all the time, but I told him I made up my mind, thinking of all the projects that you are doing. I'm finding it fascinating to join your European project. Now, what was the European project? The European project was very exceptional, even for Valnir standards. First of all, because of the composition of the group. It composed of, I think, 6 or 7 Israeli Jews, 5 Israeli Palestinians, and 2 Germans who happened to be in the country at that time. Now, people should be aware that Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians hardly ever meet as equals in Israel. They are not meeting points for them. But this was one of the exceptional places when you have a neutral meeting point of intellectuals who can come together and sit together and converse and know each other. And we, thanks to a very generous funding from Volkswagen Foundation in Germany, we worked for 3 years. We used to meet every 3rd Friday of the month and discuss method pertaining to culture. Now, the idea behind the European project was to examine to what extent Europe influences the Middle East and to what extent Middle East influences Israel. That was the first time that I came to think seriously about the issue of culture. Because until then, I was, of course, interested in culture like most of us, but never as an academic matter. And in 1991, 1992, when we actually started working, it became sort of an academic preoccupation. And Chris, you said that I'm doing many things. So I came in and out of the issue of culture throughout my life, but never as the prime preoccupation. It was always a side issue. After the 3 years of Valnir, it was always a side issue because I was more interested in other topics. I was writing other books and other articles and so on. But I published about a dozen of articles since 1991 pertaining to the culture, and for me, it's not a lot. So it was not a major issue. I became more and more engrossed with the issue of culture because of certain events that took place in the past 10 years. In the past 10 years, there were some astonishing remarks made by leaders of the free world. David Cameron, Nicolas Sarkozy, Angela Merkel, they all say that multiculturalism is passé. And not only is passé, but and it's not important, but actually it's damaging liberal democracy. And David Cameron even said that it supports terrorism. Multiculturalism supports terrorism. And someone who knows something about these issues, I was just flabbergasted. How come that he's coming up with these unfathomable accusations against multiculturalism? What on earth is going on here? Because multiculturalism was in vogue, I would say, during the 1980s, 1990s, but certainly the situation has changed in the past 10 years. So what happened? So I decided that this was about 10, 12 years ago. I decided that my next big project is going to be about multiculturalism. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to tackle 3 questions, 3 attacks on multiculturalism. The first attack is that multiculturalism is against democracy. Why is that? Because multiculturalism elevates group rights, so the critique argue, well beyond individual rights. And because liberal democracy is all about the individual, everything stems from the individual, everything should go back to the individual, and the state is just a machinery to help individualism. If you are trumping individual rights by group rights, saying the group rights are more important, then of course you're against liberal democracy. But that was the first claim that I wanted to investigate, whether this argument against multiculturalism, this critique, holds any water. The second critique, second attack on multiculturalism was, or is, still is, that multiculturalism is bad for women. But it's not only bad for liberal democracy, it's also bad for women. And why is that? because when you look at certain cultures across the world, you'll find that oftentimes certain cultures are holding group rights to discriminate against women. And in all the occasions when such things happen, when you find discrimination, you find cultural and religious claims of group rights. But that's the second attack on multiculturalism, that it's bad for women. And the third attack is the one that, the most recent one that I mentioned, is that it promotes and helps terrorism to flourish, which is the most atrocious attack there is. So I wanted to investigate these three claims, three attacks against multiculturalism.
So but they hadn't made the economic arguments or anything like that.
No, I think these are, there might be, but I didn't explore them. But I think these are the main claims against multiculturalism.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if that's a more recent phenomenon or if that was always prevalent in their old discussions too. So sorry for interrupting.
No, it's okay. So the purpose of the book was to examine to what extent multiculturalism and liberalism are reconcilable. Whether the two can go hand in hand, or if you give a voice to multiculturalism, then ipso facto, this is going to undermine liberalism. That's the major question that I wanted to tackle. And to this question, I devoted 12 years of my life to examine to what extent this is possible. And I decided to do that in a way that is going to tackle also these three questions, three attacks against multiculturalism, by the following way. First of all, I developed a theory on just, reasonable multiculturalism. And that's the first part of the book. That's the first 4 chapters. So in the first chapters, I discussed the issues of justice and what is justice. Of course, you put 10 people in the room and you ask them what is justice, you're going to receive at least 12 answers, because some people are not decided. So the issue of justice is, of course, very, very contested. I'm a follower of John Rawls, so I took elements of his theory, a theory of justice published in 1971, and I follow John Rawls. I'm a Rawlsian. I follow John Rawls in that respect, and I adopt his concept of justice. The second thing that I want to clarify, what do I mean by liberal democracy? So what is liberalism, what's democracy, and so on. So that's the first chapter, deals with the aspect of justice and liberal democracy. The second chapter deals with the issues of multiculturalism. So I explain what multiculturalism is all about. And also with the notion of reasonableness, because it's very important to me that this theory will be not only just, but it will be also reasonable. Reasonable not only to liberal Democrats. I mean, that's easy. Of course, my point of view is liberal. So, but I don't want to entertain only liberals. I want to cross the Rubicon, and I want to be able to communicate with people who are not liberal. So I want to convince them that what I'm suggesting to them is reasonable, not only just, but also reasonable. So I devise a concept of reasonableness and explain what is reasonable multiculturalism. So that's the second chapter. That's the second layer of the theory that I developed. The third layer of the theory that I developed has to do with the concept of compromise. I abhor violence. I think that the only thing that violence breeds is violence, and that's not a good thing. I'm a peace person. I've been a person of peace all my life, and I continue to be a peace person. So I'm very much endorsing the ideas of compromise, of finding the middle ground, or finding a way to accommodate different interests. The sometimes can be in conflict, but there is a way, I believe. And I believe in bridges, not in walls. So where there are some obstacles, what we need is to erect bridges. So compromise is very important. And also, I'm a follower of Jürgen Habermas and his theory of deliberative democracy. So everything can be discussed, everything can put on table, everything can put on the air, and through the clashes of ideas, we are going to deliberate and we'll find a common denominator and we move forward. So The third chapter, the third layer of the theory, has to do with compromise and deliberative democracy. And the last layer of the theory that seems contradictory at first to the third layer is the layer of coercion. Hence why the word coercion appears in the subtitle. You see, if I'm dealing with issues that are very, very conflicted, that are happening within liberal democracy, because my view is limited only to liberal democracies or to democracies, but it's not about authoritarian regimes. It's within the framework that people can converse. And I say that the state sometimes has the right to intervene, the right to pursue reasonable justice within multiculturalism. Then this means that I would ask the state to employ its force, its coercion over illiberal groups. And this, of course, is a very tricky thing to do, to ask the state to intervene against illiberalism within the state. So we need to employ some form of coercion to stop injustice from taking place. Now, of course, we always live with coercion. I mean, I don't know many people who enjoy paying taxes, but we do pay taxes. We do jury duty, and in many countries, you have to serve in the army. And we don't like it, but we do serve in the army. So coercion is part of where we live. It's part of the state, the apparatus of the state that we have to reckon with. And depending whether it is reasonable and whether the claims behind it are just, then maybe there is also a case for coercion. So that's the issue of the fourth layer, or the fourth chapter of the theory. And after I develop the theory, then I start the application of the theory. And the next three parts of the book have to do with the application of the theory. So the second part of the book, the first part of the application, has to do with physical harm, which is, relatively easy. If I swing my hand and punching your nose, you are going to bleed. It's very easy to prove that you are bleeding, and that's the result of my punching you in the nose. So two chapters have to do with cases of physical harm. So I'm taking on board issues like scarring, and I also examine female circumcision, and I examine female genital mutilation, and I examine a murder for family honor. So these are the four issues that I examine there in the physical harm. Yes, go ahead.
May I ask on that, does that cover also male genital mutilation as well? Like circumcision, or?
That's the next chapter. So,
sorry.
Because, yeah, I'm
sorry, the physical harm, does that apply to property or like extended physical harm, as in like to a family member or to a job or something like that?
No, physical harm has to do with physical harm.
So it's just body. It's just to affected by the person kind of thing.
The body of the person.
Okay.
So I make a distinction between female circumcision and female genital mutilation. Because if, for instance, there will be a cultural right in a tribe, and then these people of the tribe go into liberal democracy, and they continue to have this ritual, which is a tiny or small scar on the outer labia, then it's not much worse than male circumcision. Some even may claim it's less than male circumcision. So I would not object to that, but I certainly object to any form of female genital mutilation, which just distort the physiques of a woman and deprive women from their sexuality and harm them for lifelong. It's a lifelong torture. For this, I absolutely object. So that's the first chapter of the application, chapter 5. In chapter 6, I'm looking at male circumcision. Now, I can tell you that when I started my research in male circumcision, I had no idea how complicated this issue is. It was one of the most complicated issues that I tackled in the book. And I spent months just trying to find a way, just and reasonable way forward to accommodate male circumcision. So I put forward a proposal for humane male circumcision. I presume that not many Orthodox people were going to like my proposal, but there you have it. That's my proposal. I think that is would reconcile between multiculturalism and liberalism. And then the next two chapters are about non-physical harm. So non-physical harm has to do with deprivation of education and has to do with deprivation of property rights. There are some tribes in the liberal world that if a woman is married outside of the tribe, she doesn't have any say about the property of whatever she accumulated throughout her life. And of course, this is discriminatory and unjust. I'm very much opposed to that. And I'm also very much opposed to deny education to women because of some belief that they should stay at home and they should take care of the family and they should not go out of the house and progress themselves. I think this is wrong. I think this is evil to women, and I think that the state should not allow this to happen. And then the following chapter has to do with denying education to children. And this happens, for instance, in the Amish community in North America, including in your country, in Canada. So I'm very much opposed to that. And I explain why the state should not allow the Amish to continue discriminating against children, their own children. And then the last part of the book has to do with country case studies. Remember, there's this small issue of saying that multiculturalism promotes terrorism. So I took two countries in which claims of terrorism serve to deny multiculturalism. And these two countries are France and Israel. So I have a chapter about France and all the burqa and niqab ban in France, and I show how just ridiculous it is. The last chapter of the book has to do with discrimination against Israeli Palestinians in Israel, because in the name of religion in Israel and nationality, because there's no difference between nationality and religion in Israel, people have been discriminated against. And of course, as a human rights activist, I'm very much opposed to that, and I'm for egalitarian distribution of wealth, of justice, of all the liberties and rights within the state. That's the book.
That sounds like a phenomenally deep and introspective read, because even for writing that for yourself, you would have had to deal with all the philosophizing of figuring out what reasonable is, what justice is, what multiculturalism is. So it sounds like a really in-depth examination, even personally, of what you see in the world. Would that be accurate, do you say?
Absolutely. As I said, I've been struggling over issues that I had no idea that I'm going to tackle when I started this journey. It's a very long journey. As I said, it took me 12 years. Mm-hmm. But I did not imagine when I started, say, the writing of male circumcision to see just how complicated the issue is. And I could not imagine what I discovered when I studied Amish. You know, there's sometimes you research one thing, and then you find another matter that is connected to the first thing that you have in mind. Mm-hmm. And then you're struggling to find an answer for yourself, first of all. Should I continue to engage with this side issue that I just found?
Or is it a tangent?
Or just let it go, because it's not really what I wanted to study. With the case of the Amish, it was so alarming, and it was clouding everything, that I had to deviate from my original plan and study this thing to see whether it's hold water and how it influences what I want to say. So there was no way for me. So, but I had no idea. You know, when you are studying research, you know, when you start, you have no idea how you're going to end it.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
Yeah, because even things like education, it's hard to say what constitutes education based on different people's perspectives of it, right? Like, you could talk to one theocratic nation, and education would mean the doctrine that they're teaching, which is subjugating women and children, for example, or enabling such perverse actions as female genital mutilation. So I can imagine that even simple words that we take for granted when we're speaking, because we agree on so many of these preconceptions, how difficult it would be to write as seriously as you did about the same subject, because you almost have to define everything as you're going along, and then realizing what you've been taking for granted all this time as you write.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is a journey. I made my life a bit easier by deciding not to be universalist. I'm not a universalist. So unlike most liberals, I don't claim that the values that I uphold are universal. They're universal in principle, but not in practice. I can speak endlessly about women's rights, but it's not going to be very effective in places like Iran. So I constrict myself only to democracies. So that makes the problem that you mentioned obsolete, simply because I'm not going to encounter that. I'm going to encounter the problem that you mentioned only when it is upheld by groups within democracy who are upholding this. And then we have this balancing act to do. What should trump each other, the group rights or the individual rights? The rights of the state and the authority of the state, or the rights of the cultural group? And that's a very fine balance that you need to find a just, reasonable compromise.
But it's almost difficult even with democracies, because you have countries like the United States, which are still grappling with those same two concepts of church and state when they're dealing with abortion rights or women's access to contraception, or, any number of things, like even Britney Spears, to put it more colloquially for the people who may not be as interested, armchair polyscientists, like even pop stars are dealing with issues of being abused by men of power in a democracy, because they're exploiting rules and loopholes. And so it's almost difficult, even with that pigeonholing, to still, I think you're understating the amount of depth that you needed to cover in your own book. But just from an outsider's perspective, and again, I haven't read it, obviously. I'm looking forward to it. But okay. I think I'm looking forward to it greatly, actually, because it's one of my subjects of fascination. How people interact in integrated complex systems and how they evolve, the dynamism of it is just infinitely intricate. And it really blows my mind that somebody can tackle and wrap it into a book that's coherent and has an ending, like a start and an end point, because it seems like something that's just sort of got no beginning and no end. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much for going through in such detail. I just wanted to ask you a couple questions on the multiculturalism headlines, sort of, that you had mentioned. You'd said multiculturalism against democracy and liberalism, how it's bad for women, and how it promotes terrorism as the three arguments against it. Just putting it personally, those probably wouldn't have been the first three that I would have thought of. How did you arrive at those? Did you just scour headlines and look for what's out in popular culture, or from the books that were being published, or from conversations you had, or how did you arrive at those three?
So these claims were made, I think, around 2008, 9, 10, 11. I think these were the years. It's in my book, but around that period of time, David Cameron was making these claims, and I found it so astonishing that the Prime Minister speaks like this, that I said, I need to look into that. I need to understand, where does it stem from? Why does it speak like this? I mean, it's one thing that you and I say such a thing, but when the Prime Minister of Britain is saying such a thing, it's all the added issues of immigration, and then, a year later is pursuing Brexit that was, in the air for some time. And then he says this. There is a great influence on these things. There are repercussions. It's not just mere words. These are horrific accusations against that's intention to bury multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. So this was actually what prompted me to start the book. That was the issue. Because
it was the noise in politics, sort of, that you were hearing, eh?
The populism of that, the cavalier way to make this really serious accusation, and I think, he's an intelligent man, so he knows what will be the repercussions of that. I thought it was irresponsible, so I decided to look into that. And then the other thought. Listen, I told you that I've been working in the field of multiculturalism since 1993, so this issue is not new to me. Mm-hmm. I know what is in the literature. I know what are the issues. But none of them, the accusation that it's bad for democracy and it's bad for women, these are not new. It's been around for 20, 30 years. This extra layer of argumentation that it supports terrorism in some way, that was something that aggravates the entire discourse and make it very poisonous as well.
And it's useless. Like it offers no suggestions, no solutions, no corrections, no evidence. Like it doesn't do anything to add to the discourse whatsoever. It's basically a blanket statement that people just accept as true because they feel it.
Well, it just creates more divisions and put a bad name to certain religions, unjustifiably so. And you just create more hostilities and more bad blood. That's what you're doing, because it's not going to be accepted by people who want to have peace, notwithstanding what religion there is, and certainly it's not going to be accepted by people who are against immigration. And then you'll find innocent victims.
I noticed in countries like where I'm from, in Canada and Australia, and even some extent down in South America, a lot of the responses publicly or the against immigration has been things like economic reasons, like they cost us our tax money. We don't want them taking over our neighborhood that we grew up in. It's a lot of really personal fears that aren't justified or are baseless, and those are being exploited by politicians rather than making statements of grandeur like terrorism. They're going to blow you up and kill you. They're going to take over your neighborhood and cost you tax money or eat up all your food resources, so food's going to be more expensive, or whatever insane ideas they come up with without writing down a formula or addressing an economist. Yeah. Do you think it's different in different parts of the world, like their top 3 reasons against this type of immigration or integration, I should say, of different cultures?
No, I think you're right. I think these are quite common sort of accusation against immigration in all countries that are immigration countries, Canada, United States, Australia, Great Britain. You'll find the same kind of populist accusations against immigration that are very easy to sell by those who are of certain lineage, who just want to ride over this populist movement and harvest any political gain that they can have. And of course, it's utterly ridiculous, and it's simply not true. I can tell you about UK, for instance, that the place that is most cosmopolitan, with vast immigration, many people from all over the world, this is London. And London has been flourishing thanks to this immigration and people who came to work in Britain and so on. And the list of the voters who voted Brexit are in London. Mm-hmm. Whereas places where you don't find many immigrants, they're far less cosmopolitan than London, they voted Brexit. And when you ask them, why did you vote Brexit? They said, I didn't want the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi here. Brexit, Europe. Mm-hmm. Have you looked at the map recently? I mean, so it has nothing to do with logic. And it's nonsensical. And, the entire Brexit thing is just, it breaks my heart, because people were bought into populist, unfounded, unreasonable arguments without looking into them. And now we have it. So you're absolutely right. Economic discussions and economic reasoning drive a lot of hostilities against immigrants in many, many countries of immigration.
But the cruel irony is the economics are favorable to immigration. That's what I find so funny. I mean, it's funny, but not funny. But the things that they focus on economically, because immigration is more stimulative than just printing money. And people are more in favor of debt than actual productivity. And it just baffles me that that's the, what do you call that? The thing they hold on to when they're going to make a Brexit vote is they just don't want these people in this region for economic reasons.
Yeah, don't argue and don't mess around with me with facts. I'm not interested. Facts are not interested.
Economists don't deal in facts anyway, so I'm all right. Let me practice a bit. Raphael Cohen-Almagor?
Yeah.
Close enough?
Absolutely. Raphael Cohen-Almagor. It's actually easier than you try to make it Spanish, but I'm not Spanish.
Oh,
Raphael
I'm sorry.
Cohen-Almagor.
Almagor.
Cohen, it's an Israeli name. Cohen means that my forefathers used to serve in the temple. So Cohen, as you know, is the most prevalent name in Judaism. That means whenever you meet a Kohen, that means that his or her forefathers used to work in the Holy Temple.
I didn't know that.
And Almagor means no fear in Hebrew. Al is no, Magor is fear. So is no fear.
Oh, I'm jealous of your name. So Raphael Cohen-Almagor. Cohen-Almagor.
Yeah, Cohen-Almagor.
Did you have any final comments that you wanted to make about the book, or?
Go and read it. Invested a lot of work in it, so enjoy and make most of it. And if you have anything to say and criticize or to take from this, hope positively, and then hopefully implement this also in your way of life, you people, you governments, you societies. That's why I'm writing these books. I'm writing these books in order to have influence on people to think about these issues, and for politicians to think about what they're saying and make an impact. All my activities are very, very practical. I'm trying to write about practical things that actually matter, that make a difference and create, I believe, a better world.
I think your books do just that, and your writing and the way you speak very eloquently on the subject as well. It helps the discourse along, if nothing else, but obviously the ideas are vastly more important than just the discussion it promotes.
Thank you.
But I think just having the conversation and having the publications out there, it encourages not just people who read it, but other authors to write things that other people will read. So absolutely. I think it's very, very important, and I applaud your work and very much appreciate your contributions.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll be back in just a bit with a segment where we continue our discussions on Israel-Palestine conflict.